Since the 14th Finance Commission had mandated prudent levels of both fiscal deficit, that is 3% of GSDP, and debt to GDP for the state is 25%. That must not be breached by the states. When we consider the data from the states, except for the fiscal year 2016-17, the state government have regularly met their fiscal deficit target of 3% of GDP. This is a matter of concern because most states ended up meeting the fiscal deficit target not by increasing their revenues but by reducing their expenditure and increasingly borrowing from the market. What are your thoughts on it, sir?
Well, this question requires multiple answers, but let me start by saying the following. Number one, sort of your interpretation that 3% of GDP and 25% of GDP as fiscal deficit target is broadly true, not entirely true.
Yes.
Because the Finance Commission went a little bit. See, its recommendations are very nuanced. It went a little ahead and said that if a particular state has its debt to GDP ratio less than 25% and its interest payment to revenue less than 10% in the previous year, it can get additional borrowing space of 25 basis points. That means states can go up to 3.5% of GSDP if its debt to GSDP ratio is less than 25% and its interest payment to revenue ratio is less than 10%. Okay, now, so that means some flexibility was given to the states there. So, I want to keep the matters, clear.
Yes.
It's not just 3%. So some states which had a better borrowing capacity were given more borrowing space.
Yes.
And then what happens is that obviously any target that you give, any summary measure that you give as a target, obviously the focus will be on target.
Yes.
If you say that you should have a revenue like this and an expenditure like this, you give multiple targets, then obviously they will have to look for multiple targets. Now you can reduce the deficit either by, again, it's not that they really have much of a choice. What really happens is that the central government, they have to seek the permission of the center to borrow.
Center to borrow, yes.
The constitution gives them allows them to borrow, but if they are indebted to the center, they have to seek the permission of the center to borrow. The center will not allow them to borrow more than 3% of GSDP. So obviously they are, it's a sort of a hard budget constraint.
Yes.
When you have that, so they have the flexibility either to raise revenue. But what revenue can they raise? Particularly after the GST was ceded to the GST Council. You don't really have much of the taxes. The only major taxes they have, so-called major within inverted commas, taxes they have, is excise duty on alcohol, the value-added tax on petroleum products, motor vehicles tax, taxes on stamps and registration duties on property transfers. These are the only thing. And obviously there are limits beyond which they can raise. The administration matters a little. GST is entire administration, virtually the entire thing is taken away from them, in fact, maneuverability. So obviously they don't really have, and then what happens? The central government goes up and increases the price of petroleum products and then leaves very little scope for these people to raise taxes.
Raise taxes, yes.
No, because it raises additional excise duty. Even now, the crude oil prices have fallen. The central government has gone ahead and then increased the additional excise duty. Yes. And this additional excise duty, when you increase that, is not shareable with the states. So they don't really have have that much. In other words, you curtail the taxing space. So yes. They don't really have much of a taxing space. So what do? They don't have much of a thing where they can sell and then disinvest and do that. And of course, some of the states are now thinking because of the COVID problem. That's a different issue. But so obviously the only thing is expenditure. Here again, what happens is that the productive expenditure get the axe. Capital expenditure are the ones easy to cut because the committed expenditures on wages and salaries, and then of course interest payments, pensions, etc. cannot be done. You can't do anything. So there has been a problem. But that problem is, it is natural to, now the issue therefore is, there is, you can also ask this following the question. In fact, if you look at the FRBM review committee, which looked at the, encasing committee, which looked
Interesting
at the
point.
thing,
Yes.
they said that the target, for the fiscal responsibility, this thing target is the debt to GDP ratio.
Yes.
And in order to reduce the debt to GDP ratio, they said the anchoring variable is deficit to GDP ratio. So, that comes from there. And in fact, you see, earlier in the FRBM Act, you had a target on revenue deficit also.
Yes.
But now they don't have the revenue deficit target. So ultimately, if the objective is to raise the debt to GDP ratio and fiscal deficit is the anchor, your objective in whether to increase revenue or cut down the expenditure, sort of that doesn't get into the entire scheme of things.
Yes.
So obviously, it's a question of making allocation from the scarce resources that you have, and that's all that one can do. And the states have tried to do their best. At least they have contained their fiscal deficit within 3%.
3%.
Though there are some exceptions.
Yes.
Because, for example, because of the poor performance, the electricity distribution sector, they had to take over the loans, and then obviously the interest payment had to be paid on that. The deficits are exceeding the 3% level that was set. But by and large, they have maintained that, they had to maintain that, and then they don't really have much of a way to raise revenue, and they have to cut down expenditures.